We are now live.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the State Historical Resources Commission. I'm Lee Adams, the incoming chair. I'm a public member from Downeyville in Sierra County, and I'm going to convene this meeting to order. Today's meeting of the State Historical Resources Commission has been duly noticed. Any and all agenda items are subject to action by the commission. And at this time, I would ask you all to stand and please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the
United States of America
and the republic for which
it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Again, good morning. And as we begin, I would like to first acknowledge the stellar service of the past 2 years of my colleague, Adam SHRC, and see if he has any departing chair comments. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, thanks. I really don't have any prepared comments other than it was an honor to serve as chair, and I know that you're going to do an incredible job, and looking forward to meeting in person soon, hopefully.
Thank you, sir, and don't we all. This is the third virtual meeting of the State Historic Resources Commission. Please be patient while we work through the agenda. A special note, this year has been anything but normal, and COVID-19 certainly impacted the usual schedule of this commission. Section 5020.3D of the Public Resources Code requires the commission to meet 4 times per year, and this workshop will serve as the 4th meeting of the commission for 2020. At this point in time, I'm hoping to have introductions, and why don't we start with the vice chair and then go in alphabetical order.
Thank you. My name is Adam SHRC. I live in Culver City. I represent archaeology on the commission, and I am the archaeology manager for the Southern California Edison Company.
Let's see, we have 3 H's. I think Janet's next.
Good morning. My name is Janet Hansen, and I live in Palm Springs. I represent history on the commission.
And I think I am next, Alan Hess. I'm from Irvine, California, and I represent architecture.
Lee, I went with first names, so don't worry about it.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah. That's hilarious. Okay, very good.
Next, this is Luis Hoyos. I live in San Dimas in Los Angeles County. I teach architecture at Cal Poly Pomona, and for the commission, I cover history of architecture.
Thank you all. And I think we're missing a few colleagues. And just as a reminder, I'm Lee Adams. I represent the public, and I am from Downeyville in Sierra County. It is my pleasure to introduce our Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, Janon Saunders, and she will introduce her staff and possibly speak a bit about this interesting 2020 year. And I apologize for huskies howling in the background if you guys can hear them.
We all love our puppies, don't we? Good morning. I'm Janon Saunders. I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. Pleased to be with you this morning and to see all of you virtually. Apologies from the State Historic Preservation Officer, Julianne Polanco. I'm not feeling well this morning, and so she asked me if I would take on representing her, which I am happy to do. Staff that we have with us on presenting this morning are Jay Correa, supervisor of our registration and environmental compliance unit, as well as historians in our registration programs, Amy Crane and William Berg. And then we are happy to have joining us General Counsel for California State Parks, Tara Lynch, along with another one of our members of our council, Parveen Kasray. I do know Parveen, how to pronounce Parveen's first name, so I apologize, Parveen, if I mangled your last name. And did want to just say briefly a big thank you to the staff of the Office of Historic Preservation and our commissioners for putting up with what has been a very difficult year, where people might have thought that this year would have represented a little bit less work for our office and our commission. We found that actually the opposite was quite true, and this has been an incredibly busy year, and folks have really stepped up and worked hard to deal with all of the environmental reviews that we're doing to keep projects happening in California despite the shutdown and everything else that's been going on, as well as processing a lot of nominations. As our commissioners are very well aware, the last couple of meetings especially, we've seen a lot of properties being nominated and getting listed, which is very exciting. So a big thank you to our staff for working through what has been a difficult year for many reasons, and they just continue to do a stellar job serving our customers and making sure that historic preservation is happening in the state of California. So thank you to our staff, and thank you to you commissioners for hanging in there with us.
Thank you for that, Janan. And again, I just want to reiterate what you said, the impact of everything on the staff, and you and Julie, you are all stellar at what you do. And just a reminder or a comment that of all the Zoom meetings I've had since March, our July or August meeting at 9 hours and 154 people involved. And you acted as an air traffic controller, managing all those people and the staff. Pretty amazing. So thank you. A message to members of the public joining us. Those members of the public with us today wishing to ask questions or make verbal comments during the meeting must email the State Historic Resources Commission at calshippo.shrc@parks.california.gov, or you can telephone the Office of Historic Preservation at 916-445-7000. Your questions will be read and answered during the meeting. The public may otherwise observe remotely in accordance with the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. So with that out of the way, Janan, would you like to kick this off?
Of course, actually, I am just going to say I'm going to turn things over to our ABLE registration unit staff. I believe Jay is going to make some introductory comments, and then Amy and William will be giving you your training this morning. So Jay, take it away.
Thanks, Janan. I'm not on mute, it looks like, so good. Okay. So as Janan said, I hope to just give you a broad overview of the registration unit, and then I have some numbers I've pulled together in the last few days. I apologize, I don't have any slides. So I'll try to, keep it a little bit brief, and then both Amy and William will go into greater detail. So I feel really bad that we couldn't just sit around in the basement of a historic Carnegie Library like our last training quite a few years ago, or in the San Diego Firehouse Museum and just sit around with our feet up on the table and talk about these things. But I think actually it'll be just fine with Zoom. So some numbers. The registration unit processes about 45 nominations a year, sometimes as many as 50 and sometimes down into the 40, approximately 40. But we hold pretty steady at about 45 nominations a year. And of course, as many of you know now, this commission is very experienced by this time. Some of these nominations are for districts containing anywhere from 50 to 1,800 properties, right? And the whole year, I'm very proud of that. That's a huge accomplishment. The View Park Historic District had about 1,800 houses in it. So it's not unusual for us to receive district nominations with 100, 200, and periodically 400 contributing properties. So I have some latest numbers from our information management unit. They're a little bit old, a few years old, but still they're so large that they haven't varied that much. So we have approximately in California 17,000 individually listed and contributing resources on the National Register. So as of March of 2013, there were 2,500, almost 2,600 nominations approved for the National Register. And I thought this was interesting perspective. I was reading an article on a completely unrelated topic last weekend, and the article was actually on gas appliance use on the interior of our home, in the interior of our homes. And the estimate is that California has about 14 million homes. So I think that's important because some people who maybe are nervous about the government listing properties on the National Register might fear that, you know, there's a lot of properties, but I think when you compare 17,000 individually listed properties to 14 million homes, you can see that it's just a tiny percentage. So I have some, let me see if I should read these. No, I'm going to hold off on those other stats. So this registration unit, I'm not sure that all of you realize this, as it is today, the three of us really began around March of 08 when I started at OHP. William Berg joined a year later and Amy Crane approximately a year after that. And I thought I would, just to kind of lighten things up a little bit, I'll never forget that William and I met for lunch just prior to a start date. And we ate at a lunch counter, which I know is one of William's favorite things, a lunch counter in one of Sacramento's downtown historic buildings. I don't remember the name. He probably does. And then Amy started a year later on April 6th, which was my start date with state parks. Happened to be my mother's birthday. So April 6th is an auspicious date, I think. There were a lot of turnovers due to retirements prior to us starting. Partially in response to those exciting times, I was tasked very explicitly to improve public relations and make the registration programs more accessible and to list properties. I mean, the SHPO at the time put his finger in my chest and said, your job is to list properties. So I think we've done a good job of that. We're all motivated by California's diversity. All three of us are completely absorbed with documenting the stories of immigrant groups, of underrepresented groups, the artistic, and as you know, sometimes the eccentric. But I think strongly that the properties nominated in California must tell the story of California and who we Californians. So a little bit more, diving a little deeper. I know that it seems to me in the past that maybe Commissioner Hess has really expressed a lot of curiosity, and others, you know, how does the review process begin? And everything kind of filters down to my desk. I try to not force nominations upon any of the three of us, so it's pretty informal. I'll even lay them out, and we'll frequently informally center around them and discuss the nominations and kind of divvy them up amongst us. We all have our interests, and although as things have been busier this year, nominations have been reviewed by folks that, you know, that topic isn't necessarily their favorite topic of interest, but we all chip in and do what we need to do. Notices have to go out. The nominations are logged in. I think that over the years, one of the first things that I do, and most of us do, is turn to the summary statement of significance. I'm not sure that the commission realizes that's what we do right away. At least that's what I do, because you can almost tell instantly by the first few sentences of the summary statement of significance whether the applicant has carefully read the bulletins. It really must begin with a clear, almost a concise thesis statement saying that XYZ property is eligible for the National Register under criterion X within the context of Y, you know. And so, you know, in some ways, I'm probably getting into things I wanted to talk about later. We're grading papers in a lot of ways. We're looking for tight sentence structure, full explanation of a statement that's made. And I think I think writing standards have increased even since this group's tenure began at OHP. More attention, I believe is placed on areas of significance. I know for one, I paid very little attention to that in the beginning, and now it's become more critical. The National Register once clearly articulated what the area, and you hear that in our staff reports when we mention the area of significance that properties are eligible under. The National Park Service has asked that interiors be more closely paid attention to. We've even gotten some not out, we rarely get rejections, but we will get questions from the National Park Service asking us to answer these. And then when we do, they will list the property. I wrote down that I think in many ways the registration unit is coaching folks to get A's on these papers. And when they are at the A level, that's when we bring them to you. All three of us marvel, especially in recent times, how the complexity of nominations has vastly increased. All you have to do is consider borough flats. We see a lot more traditional cultural properties. We have seen, after a little bit of a lull about 4 years ago, where we had a string of meetings with no controversy, it seems to us that controversy has increased dramatically. So as I think Amy said yesterday, these are not just pretty Victorian home nominations. So the conundrum is encouraging all citizens to write nominations, but really the quality must be nearly professional. And so that's on a daily basis. I talk to folks on the phone, encouraging them to nominate, but I would feel like a liar if I wasn't straightforward and honest and tell folks that it really requires a strong writing effort. It pains me sometimes to do that because the property is easily eligible. The person I'm speaking to doesn't have multiple thousands of dollars to hire a consultant, and yet I quickly can assess that the person's going to have a real difficult time nominating the nomination or nominating the property. So, and I suppose the counter argument is that if you read older nominations, it quickly becomes apparent that they're almost worthless from trying to understand the significance of the property today, and it becomes even more critical in a land use situation. So last summer, I spent 6 hours assisting an applicant. This is over the course of about 3 weeks, assisting a potential tax credit applicant in McLeod, California, up near the base of Mount Shasta. The McLeod Historic District nomination did not even have a map. There was no boundary drawn around the district. In the broadest interpretation, the building that the kind lady wanted to perhaps restore using tax credits, in the broadest interpretation, you could have argued it was in the district, but we are a governmental entity and doing the right thing by public noticing, et cetera. Really, the nomination will have to come back to the commission to certify that the boundary included her historic hospital building. Reading a nomination that's just come before us, the Winehaven building in Richmond. I mean, it's this florid language about how the employees probably drank their product while they were working at the winery. And, I love anecdotal stories, but assigning significance to Winehaven would not be based on the drinking habits of the employees. So in other words, I guess that I'm trying to say that the need for higher levels of writing is warranted, I think. So, on to other duties, and I'll wrap it up here. Of the registration unit, you see those nominations that come before you, but we also review part ones of the federal 20% tax credit application process, right? And so it's our unit that really, working in conjunction with Tim Brandt, who manages the program, really decide whether or not the property is going to meet National Register criteria and be able to qualify for the tax credit program. Sometimes they could be fun. Sometimes they're very tough and problematic because folks are wanting to engage the tax credit program that have no experience whatsoever in writing of any kind. especially National Register nominations. So I'm not sure that many of the commissioners are aware of the federal Section 110 process. Approximately 6 years ago, the State Historic Preservation Officer assigned the review of what we call 110s to the registration unit. And I had kind of secretly always thought that it would be a good thing because we analyze properties probably a little bit more leaning towards preservation and eligibility. So those have increased. In fact, early in this year, our numbers said that our review of 110s quadrupled. As the year has gone on, the number coming in has slowed down. And so we're still at about triple for this year compared to prior years. So a little bit about the 110 process very briefly. Section 110 of the National Historic Preservation Act directs federal agencies to identify, evaluate, nominate, and manage, and even use historic properties under their care. And so they submit these analyses to us to review, and we agree or not agree with the agency that the property is eligible or not eligible. So just another aspect of the registration unit. I think most of you have gotten wind over the last few years that we review nominations of federal properties, right? This is federal agencies nominating their federal properties. I know that I've spoken again with Commissioner Hess. He's familiar with some of these recently nominated properties down in the Southland. The federal building at 1,000 or 10,000 Wilshire Boulevard, the building in Orange County that was constructed originally for Rockwell and then was sold to the GSA. And so those are the types of, and then sometimes they're very mundane. They're fire campsites owned by the United States Forest Service, and all the buildings were constructed in the 1960s, and they're, you know, prefabricated buildings. So those are easy. We would agree that those probably are not eligible. So moving on to what I'll call current news. It seems like about a year ago, last September of 2019, work increased. I'm just fascinated to try to understand the ebb and flow of work. And we stayed busy during the last holiday season. And then, of course, everything just came to a halt last March with the COVID, with the onset of COVID. And then just after March, there's just a dramatic increase in phone inquiries and emails and nominations, which is all good, but we definitely have been playing a lot of frantic catch up. So when I first came to the unit, there were approximately 120 properties on the inventory list. And a large percentage of those were 3 and 4 years old. So there was a backlog of archaeological nominations. And until about a year or two ago, that inventory list was hanging out around more in the 80s, about 80 nominations, I would say, that were actively working. Right now, we ran some numbers, and about the numbers climbed back up, which at first seems alarming, but it's not a backlog really. We're back up into the 120 or more range, but at least half or more of those are just a year or two old. So there's not this really old backlog of properties. A lot of these too, it's just so important to note that a lot of the properties that are hanging out that are older, it's really a result of the applicants not answering our requests for further information, or sometimes a project, it's a project related nomination and the project was completed or it stalled. So I just was, again, reading some information. I had done some research with other states in order to prepare data for the prior State Historic Preservation Officer. And the folks in Texas said just every case is really different. And so it's hard to make generalizations. I'll wrap it up here, but again, just some fun numbers. For Carol Rowland a few years ago, I I ran some numbers, and out of 52 nominations, it's approximately 5 years ago, there were 21 federal, and that's federal government nominating federal property. I think that was a little high that year. City government nominated 3. There were 3 nominations. The tax credit program registration reviewed 3 of those. Purely citizen and or owner nominations. So that includes citizens nominating their own property or any other property. There were 8. And then historical societies / tribes / nonprofits, 17 nominations. And I have a note included in this category are historical societies nominating federal property. So private entities or outside entities nominating federal property. So I hope some of that makes sense to you. It's I find it very interesting. I guess the message here is that maybe these numbers don't reflect it entirely, but it's becoming more and more the purview of consultants. So anyway, we decided early on that we could take maybe a couple of questions before I pass it on to my colleagues, but save a more in-depth discussion for later in the program. So,
Any commissioner questions for Jay or comments? Janan, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, just a quick question. Jay, you mentioned there were a number of federal properties nominated by federal agencies. Did they come to the commission at all because there were portions that had private property, or did they go straight through from the FIPO to the unit and to the parks?
A great question. And I believe that when I assembled these numbers, they did not have a private property component. Actually, it's like, anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really kind of rare. Maybe until very recently, it was rare to have a federal nomination with a private property component. And again, that gets into the situation that, you know, every case is a little different, because I know that I've been told by our contact in Washington that sometimes it depended on the percentage of private property versus federal property as to whether or not, oh, maybe I'm getting myself tongue twisted here, but that even that played a role as to whether or not the commission would necessarily hear it. I think in today's world, though, in our more careful era, anytime there's a private property component, it certainly would come to the commission, but it's rare. It's rare. So
Thanks.
I would argue that those 21 federal nominations, I would be surprised if even one of those came to the commission. And again, I think these were 2015 numbers. So.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners for Jay? Janan, do we have any registered speakers or anybody else who has any questions or comments?
Actually, we just had one comment that came up on the YouTube live stream chat. Somebody asked to restate the email address for sending questions. So it is calshpo.parks.ca.gov. And I am keeping an eye on that email for questions, which I will hold until the end or until between segments and then read them off at the appropriate time. So any member of the public who has a question, please email it to that email address, or you can call our front desk at 916-445-7000 and give your question to our executive secretary, and she'll hand those off to me as well. Thank you.
Very, very good. And another reminder, both of those locations, the web address and phone number, are also on the public notice that are on the website if anybody struggles with either one of those. So very good, very good. Any other commissioner comments at this time? Okay, we shall move on as you folks wish. Let's see. I'm
not sure if it's William or Amy next, so I'm assuming they'll take over. William or Amy? Guys up. There we go.
Yes, I just started the slideshow. And as Jay mentioned, just before I started working for the Office of Historic Preservation, we met for lunch at the Capitol Park Cafe on the ground floor of the Capitol Park Hotel, which has since closed, sadly, but happily, it's because there is a historic rehab tax credit project that's going to take place that will rehabilitate the entire building. So that's one of the outcomes that we focus on in our unit, is turning places that we care about into places that future generations are going to care about because they will have been restored and preserved. And the presentation that I'm going to show is intended both for commissioner education to show how we do in-house review and things to look for when you as a commissioner are reviewing the nomination, but also for the general public and ways to improve and bring better focus to nominations, and so they understand how our process works. For sometimes there's a confusion because this is a specialized skill, and it's not always obvious how we work. We want to be as transparent to the public as possible on how we operate, and people can learn either by contacting us directly or hopefully by showing these videos, because this meeting's video will be available afterward for the public to review. And I'm going to be talking about the nomination process. I'm going to be focusing primarily on National Register of Historic Places, but most of it is also applicable to California programs, including the California Register and Landmarks and Points programs, because the National Register provides an effective and widely recognized template for many things like photo standards and documentation standards, so they don't necessarily need to be replicated in new form at the state or local level. And as far as the nomination process goes, anyone can submit a nomination to any of our programs. And generally, that doesn't mean that anyone can submit a successful nomination. You do not need any particular certification or educational background in order to submit a nomination. As Jay mentioned, there's a wide diversity of people who submit nominations. Some are professional consultants, yes, but others are members of the public. You do need to have a certain amount of technical writing skill, the ability to do research and architectural descriptions. So obviously, it's very helpful if one is a historian or a technical writer. Some of the most successful nominations we've had in recent years are written by, one comes to mind that was written by a software engineer, but they knew how to write and they knew how to do the research. And so our job as staff is to help translate the knowledge of the people of California into a technical and bureaucratic form that satisfies legal requirements. Because one of the implications of our program, this program creates regulatory restrictions on the federal government and on local governments, not on private property owners. And so because of that, it's our obligation that the information is correct, is correctly formatted, properly documented, and available to the public. So one of the first things we do when we open up a nomination that we receive is what's in there. Does it include a checklist of different items that we'll go over shortly? So the nomination is complete and we can begin review. And part of it does have to do with where the nomination comes from. The federal regulations have changed in recent years. So federal nominations, which Jay discussed earlier, if they come from a federal agency, we have to respond within 45 days. So that has actually changed. And previously, federal nominations, while it was encouraged to review them with all possible speed, there wasn't a time limit. Now, if we don't comment within 45 days, the federal agency has the option to submit it without SHPO approval, and with the assumption that the SHPO does not. So those jump to the head of the line, and those are one of the factors that has changed, in addition to the increase in programs that we're administering and workload distribution, that why many other nominations may be pushed back. Other things we consider when we're triaging a nomination, when it first comes in, is there an immediate risk to the property? Is there a reason why this should jump to the head of the line in terms of priority or emergency? And then how complete is it? A nomination that comes in a very complete form and is ready to go is probably going to get heard faster than one that needs extensive review. We do have a checklist for submission on our website, both for the National Register and the California Register, and then the checklists for landmarks and points are within Technical Assistance Bulletin 13. But they still require a physical package to be sent to our office. We do not allow entirely electronic submission. So the nomination still, we do require electronic format, but it needs to be in the form of a CDR or DVD or a flash drive or other digital media. We're also occasionally working with people who will send in the hard copy printed format, but transferring the files to us digitally via the internet, via other means. But we need both digital format, then that means Microsoft Word in terms of the nomination, and then TIFF for files, and then printed copies of the nomination. One is sent to the property owner upon receipt of the nomination. The other is used as a scratch copy. And the registration unit staff, we're all old enough where we very often prefer the tactile feel of a piece of paper that we can scribble on and make notes on. It's a much more functional way even than using Microsoft Word to track changes within a document. We do require one set of color photo prints in addition to the digital media, but the digital media is the reference copy. The prints are handy. They become something that become part of the California record of the property. But the digital files, and we'll talk about photos a little bit later, are the reference and the key thing that we look at. We require a sketch map and a photo key and a location map. Another thing that's changed that we're still trying to get out, and consultants are not immune to not learning these requirements because we still get the old USGS maps occasionally, now more often in digital format than physical paper USGS maps with the location marks in pencil. But the registration unit does not currently encourage the use of USGS maps for nominations because they locate properties in UTMs, which are accurate to within about 10 meters, whereas the current National Park Service standards for maps using Google Earth or Bing Maps use decimal degrees, which not only are they compatible with geographic information system software, but they're also accurate within 6 inches. So you're able to obtain a much higher level of precision as well as compatibility with modern GIS systems by using a decimal degree map and a digital photo map. One of the things we look for when a nomination comes in is, are they using the current forms? The National Park Service revises the National Register nomination forms every 3 years, and it's very easy to get mixed up. If you've been working in this field a while and you have older copies, it can be a little hard to tell at first glance whether or not you're using the current forms, but you can always check that reference by taking a look at the link to National Park Service's website on our page, or just re-downloading the latest forms. Better safe than sorry. And very often we have returned nominations or asked consultants to revise a nomination so it uses the current forms. I mentioned photographs, and one of the things that trip people up is photograph naming standards. And there's a standard that we request people use, starting with just the 2 letters of the state, CA, and then an underscore, and then the name of the county, in this case, Napa County, and then the name of the nomination, and then a 4-digit number, and that is the photograph number. A couple things about photographs is there are specific standards implemented about 5 or 6 years ago, actually I think around 2012, 2013, that at the time seemed fairly stringent. 2 megapixels minimum, 6 megapixels recommended. At the time, 6 megapixels was the realm of professional digital cameras and 2 megapixels was more of consumer grade. Today, 6 megapixels is more on the low end of people's camera phones. So the standards haven't changed, and that means that as time has gone on, the digital media requirement has actually become much more accessible. We always prefer if someone has a SLR digital camera that will take a high quality shot, but if the only tool you have is a phone camera, as long as it meets those basic requirements and you can capture the sites that you want to photograph adequately, then there's no need to get a professional photographer. But if you have the budget, it's nice and can produce a lasting image. One other major reminder for anybody is that don't put people in your photos. One of my favorite photos that came in with a nomination was for the Western Railway Museum, where in addition to documenting the right-of-way and the buildings and some of the streetcars, they followed up with an absolutely adorable photo of a little girl hopping off of a streetcar after a trolley ride in absolute joy of her experience. But because it was a photograph of a minor child for which we had no release from her family giving permission to use that photo, we couldn't include it with the nomination. So keep that in mind when you're documenting properties. Is the intent of contemporary photos of the site is to document the physical structure rather than inadvertently capture people. Figures are related to photographs, and often these are things like articles, newspaper clippings, historic photos, and we encourage their use in order to provide better historic context, their immediate visual cue, and to assess historic integrity. If a contemporary photo matches a historic photo, then you have a good sense of the property's integrity. But they should not be included with the nomination photographs. They should be included on continuation sheets within the Microsoft Word document of the nomination. And you can see a couple of good examples of figures here. They are numbered, starting with a figure log that enumerates where the properties came from, and they also include the source of the photograph. Very often these are archival photos, and it's always good practice to indicate where you got them. Maps, in addition to the now the Google Earth map, we encourage, especially for districts, the use of a map that shows the entire district, indicating which properties are contributors and which are non-contributors. And the practice here isn't quite perfect. You'll notice that the contributors and non-contributors are in different colors. The problem is that if this is copied onto black and white, or someone who can't distinguish those colors, it's hard to tell which are contributors or which are non-contributors. But you notice there's also a different pattern. So even though they're different colors, and that's the first key that most people would notice, if there was a black and white copy, you could still distinguish between the two. And then another good practice is a photo key, indicating where your photos are taken from. A photo key that of a map is not required, but it can be very handy in order to give a reviewer a sense of where within a district or within a large property that specific photos were taken. The Google Earth or Google Maps requirement is actually making the creation of area maps easier because they're very accessible. They're relatively simple to create and to implement, and they include things like a north arrow and scale, so it isn't necessary to do so. When you're creating a map of this sort, make sure that you indicate the name of the property and its decimal degree location, and make sure that you're using decimal degrees, not degrees, minutes, seconds on the map. RFI letters, or requests for information, are something that we deal with a lot. If a nomination comes in, very, very rarely do we simply return it for being insufficient. It happens sometimes, but it's not very common. I think it's something that happens maybe once a year. Whereas RFI letters, where the nomination is mostly ready, the property looks like it could be something eligible, but there's something missing. Either there's a component of the nomination, a physical component that needs to be addressed or repaired, or there's an element within the text of the nomination where things weren't done, again, in the bureaucratic manner that we expect. And very often the people who send these nominations in, they are historians, they are experts, they're the people of California who have the firsthand knowledge, but being able to convey that in particular ways is the skill that we attempt to impart. And sometimes people respond to an RFI letter as though it is a rejection letter, that we've told them that the property isn't eligible or that they aren't allowed to nominate. And I hope that if there's one thing I hope that in our process that we convey that message that, okay, this looks good, but it needs a fix as gently as we can. And whenever we review a nomination, we start like even something as simple as not marking up a nomination using red pen. So if I send someone a nomination with marked up with green ink, it feels a little better. and with the direction of this is how we get you to the finish line. This is how the nomination can be successful. We, as staff who are located in Sacramento, don't necessarily know the information that the answers that we're looking for, but we want to include those answers so when it's heard by the commission and read by the keeper, it is as complete and has as many answers as possible. Sometimes it is an iterative process. The RFI letter might be a formal letter sent in the mail. Sometimes there are other methods of getting relatively simple information. If it's something minor, an email or a phone call often can substitute for an RFI letter. But the nice thing about a letter is it creates a documentation trail and it creates a reference for the applicant to be able to refer back to when they're doing their revisions, if there's a complex thing that needs to be done or references to specific elements of the nomination document. Once a nomination has been reviewed, once all the components are in place and any RFI issues have been resolved, that's when we try to schedule it for a commission meeting. As Jay mentioned, often there is a triage function before a nomination can be heard. We look at workload. We look at when we were still doing physical meetings at geography, whether we're going to be in Northern or Southern California. Often, if we're going to be in Southern California, we might try to prioritize having Southern California nominations or a nomination that is controversial. If the meeting is being held someplace closer to the property's site, then we might try to hear it at that meeting. But if the nomination is controversial and there's a time issue, we might want to hear it first, even before, even if we're not going to be anywhere near it, because there's an issue with the property. And that means that there is never a guarantee of when your nomination is going to be heard. And we try to balance and juggle as best we can. But it's simply a matter of the fact that we are a staff of 3, and California is a very large state. And as Jay mentioned, we are seeing a significant upsurge in the number of nominations, which is terrific. It means that we're, to some extent, doing our job and letting people know that we have this program. But the capacity to review those nominations in a manner that is fair and equitable and thorough means that there is that bottleneck of staff time and attention. Once the nominations are ready, they are posted to our website, and that means about 60 days before the meeting. So we post at the same time we send out notifications, so we don't have to send as many paper copies of the nomination. They're entirely available, and if you click on the name of the nomination, the entire nomination appears. New changes in state law requires that all documents that are posted on California State Parks websites are ADA accessible. So they are all in a format that can be reviewed even by people who have visual impairment. And we do everything we can to make those documents available, not just before the hearing, but also after the hearing for future reference. The notification letters go out. We're required to send them out between 30 and 75 days for certified local governments, which is any government that has an authorized CLG program. They've worked with our local government unit to create local ordinances and hearing bodies. They have to be notified by about 65 days, so they have time to review the nomination and provide comment. But we still provide a copy to local governments, cities or counties, to the county government, to the property owner, and to the applicant, and any interested parties who had signed up to be notified about a particular nomination. And then we also send out via State Parks a press release to notify the press that the hearing is being held and that we are able to take comment. Now, for commission review, here we see from a couple years ago. I think this was from our last meeting in Palm Springs. The commissioners are notified at about the same time that the nominations have been posted, but they also previously they received a physical binder. And then until a few years ago, we sent a CDR containing the files that were posted on the website, as well as any other supporting documentation, such as confidential archaeological nominations. And now the electronic binder is now a website that is essentially, it's a private website that the commissioners have access to, where they can download that information and access it immediately. And staff can also dynamically update that information. So instead of if something comes in after the electronic binder date, we can simply upload it to the site and notify the commissioners that it is there. Now, the hearing itself has a couple of consequences, but one thing that doesn't happen, and this is if there's one another myth I think that people assume, is in the case of the California Register listing of properties that are National Register nomination. When the National Register nomination is heard and the commission votes on it, that does not place the property in the California Register. Not until the nomination has been submitted to the keeper and listed in the National Register, then it is added to the California Register. Rather, the difference is that, and Amy will talk about this more, a California Register nomination is heard, and if it's approved at the meeting and signed, then it is immediately added to the California Register, but that's specific to California Register nominations rather than National Register. Listing, as I mentioned, California Register is listed immediately. National Register is packaged and submitted now electronically to National Park Service, and there's actually when National Park Service's digital media standards were published, people assumed that the states would accept all digital nominations. That's not yet the case. And then because of COVID and the needs to have files transferred digitally to people working from home, we have a new standard that lets us transfer the files electronically, but the delay after a commission meeting for National Register nominations is typically about 45 days. In the case of controversial nominations where there's the particular focus, in some cases, properties nominated under criterion B are not they require a higher level of review, and so it takes a little longer than the 45 days, but typically about 2 months. And in the case of California historical landmarks or points of historical interest, those require a countersignature by the Director of State Parks, which can take a while. And we're in the process of resolving a new method rather than using paper nominations, but transitioning to an electronic signature format for those documents as well. And that concludes my nominations discussion. And I do have we can hear any questions if there are any regarding this presentation.
Adam, go ahead.
Hey, Bill, you touched on it briefly. Could you give a little bit more detail on how confidential data is managed now, given that we have access to an online site that we pull data from?
The online site is a secure site. So instead of sending the confidential archaeological nominations via email with a password, they can be downloaded directly.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners for William? Janan, any incoming questions from registered folks or the public?
None so far, so we are good.
Okay. Thank you. Janet.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. I'm just curious in terms of the nominations that you get. I mean, I flip to the back page often and look and see who's prepared the nominations, and I agree that the quality of them is pretty stellar. How often do you get, just an average citizen trying to do a nomination? And, I think William had mentioned before that sometimes you can tell immediately that this is just not going to work and they're probably going to need help. I'm just wondering how many maybe drop away because the person doing the nomination really isn't capable of doing it on their own and can't afford any help.
Some. I'd say about a quarter of my current caseload are nominations that are stuck in the RFI phase. But it's not necessarily because they're members of the public who aren't able to complete the nomination. And in some cases they are. There's essentially I returned them, or I sent an RFI letter that says you need this, this, and this. And for other reasons, life intervenes, or their attention is the missing factor. But we also get consultants who, they were only paid for a certain amount of work, and in order to do the RFI, they need to get paid a little bit more. And that's why we don't hear from them. But so I don't necessarily think that consultants are a universal solution for National Register nomination. And in some cases, we have people who started out as members of the general public who have, since their first nomination was successful, started their own consulting business. And in one of the case studies, we'll see that one of the members of the public who submitted a nomination became the chair of the State Historical Resources Commission.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Luis, I want to make sure I'm not ignoring you. I can see everybody else. Do you have any questions? In case you're waving a hand. I will assume that's a no. I was going to. Oh,
I have a quick one.
yes.
Bill, for nominations of Native American resources, does OHP do any type of outreach to the tribes that may be culturally affiliated with that resource, or do they expect the nominator to perform that function?
It's done by the nominating party. We notify the property owner. So the property owner is tribal, then we notify that property owner. Amy, I think, can maybe speak to that because she's worked a lot specifically with city of Palm Springs, which has a lot of Native American owned property. But because we're working within the program of the National Register, it's very different from Section 106, which requires the people doing the Section 106 research to do outreach. Anyone can nominate a National Register property, but they need to include owner information. So what we do is we contact the owner information that we have.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I guess we can move on.
All right. Amy, I'll go ahead and start your portion of the presentation.
Thank you.
Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. For both the National Register of Historic Places and the California Register of Historical Resources, a property must have both significance and integrity. Why is this place important? To whom? And how does it physically convey that importance? Properties must have significance under one or more criteria and integrity to be eligible. Next. The criteria for listing historical resources on the California Register of Historical Resources are consistent with those developed by the National Park Service for listing historical resources on the National Register of Historic Places. So, although today's agenda indicated differences between the California Register and the National Register, comparing the registers is more accurate. Next. There are two key differences. The criteria, identified as A, B, C, and D for the National Register, have been modified for state use, identified as 1, 2, 3, and 4, in order to include a range of historical resources which better reflect the history of California and, next, historical resources that may not retain sufficient integrity to meet the criteria for listing on the National Register may still be eligible for listing on the California Register. Next. So this is not a site of recognition. The property must still be extant and must retain sufficient integrity to convey its significance. The property must retain enough of its historic appearance and original material to convey that character and significance. Now, integrity is not to be confused with condition, the appearance of the property at the time of nomination that must be referenced as part of the narrative description. In some instances, poor condition may allow for better integrity. One of the first site visits I did within a month or two of starting at OHP, Jay, William, and I went to see Preston Castle, and part of the roof was missing. There were floors missing, but we still had a really good look at original materials. We had a sense of the scope of the property. And actually, the property was already listed at that time. It was listed at the state level of significance. And we visited the site because the sponsoring parties were interested in seeing if they could actually relist the property at the national level of significance. And there have been some interim discussions over the years, but we haven't yet seen that documentation. So integrity must always be grounded in an understanding of a property's physical features and how they relate to its significance. Next. A resource that has lost its historic character or appearance may still have sufficient integrity for the California Register if it maintains the potential to yield significant scientific or historical information or specific data. Next. The United States Army Air Force's B-24J Liberator, number 42-73387 crash site, heard by the Commission in May 2011, was listed on the California Register under Criterion 1 for its historic association with the development of the United States military aviation history, particularly during World War II. The debris field contained enough crash-related material evidence to help identify the site's location. Relatively unchanged since the crash, the site's rugged rock and scrub-covered setting also reportedly contains the scattered remains of 3 of the bomber's 7-man crew, making it a potential war grave site. While the property may have had sufficient integrity for nomination to the National Register under Criterion D for information potential, nomination to the California Register was possible under Criterion 1 for association with events. Next. Where the National Register has 7 criteria considerations, special requirements that have to be met for certain types of properties to be eligible for listing, the California Register has 3 special considerations. Moved buildings, structures, or objects similar to the National Register's criteria consideration B, moved properties. A moved resource that is otherwise eligible may be listed on the California Register if it was moved to prevent its demolition at its former location, and if the new location is compatible with the original character and use of the historical resource. Properties should retain historic features and compatibility in orientation, setting, and general environment. Next. Historical resources achieving significance within the past 50 years. In order to understand the historic importance of a resource, sufficient time must have passed to obtain a scholarly perspective on the events or individuals associated with the resource. A resource less than 50 years old may be considered for listing on the California Register if it can be demonstrated that sufficient time has passed to understand its historical importance. While a property may not need to be of exceptional importance, as required to satisfy criteria consideration G in a National Register nomination, a scholarly perspective is still required. Next. The leg-like clay sculptures, heard by the Commission in January 2012, followed the 2009 hearing of a similar nomination for La Laguna de San Gabriel. At the time of nomination, both properties were less than 50 years old, and the California Register was perceived as having a lower bar for period of significance. The clay sculptures were the work of Mexican master concrete artist Benjamin Dominguez. His style combined playful sculptural designs and functional playground equipment to create imaginative sculptures intended for active playground use. Next. Liability concerns have caused the removal of similar playgrounds, making parks like Leg Lake a rare and threatened resource. Listing on the California Register encouraged public recognition for the resources and provided some protection under the California Environmental Quality Act. Next. A reconstructed building less than 50 years old may be eligible if it embodies traditional building methods and techniques that play an important role in a community's historically rooted beliefs, customs, and practices. A Native American roundhouse, for example. Next. So my next few slides deal with correcting misperceptions. And I added this information because often we have been contacted for people wanting to do a California Register nomination because they think it's easier, faster, has a lower bar for integrity than the National Register. And so when someone calls, one of our first questions is, what program are they applying to? If they state the California Register, we ask a few more questions. One of those issues may be that they don't realize that the National Register, although a federal program, does not require national level of significance. And so there we can let them know that properties on the National Register, about 90% of them are listed at the local level of significance, about 9% at the state level of significance, and only 1% at that national level of significance. And then we let them know that a property listed on the National Register is automatically included on the California Register. So they don't have to start with the California Register and then move on to the National Register. They can actually accomplish both in one go. Every once in a while, after a series of questions and some discussion, they're still really set on applying to the California Register. And so I wanted to add some information here to try and clarify some of the misperceptions that we have seen and heard over the years from both private property owners and from consultants. So properties must still retain enough historic character or appearance to be recognizable as historical resources and to convey the reasons for their significance. And again, this is not to be confused with condition, such as the temporary absence of ice in an ice skating rink. Next. Belmont Square, heard by the Commission in May 2019, retains physical characteristics that reflect a strong sense of time and place from its 1924 period of significance and architect David Whitmer's creativity and vision for the complex. Next. The loss of materials and workmanship, namely decorative facade features, suggested the property might not have retained sufficient integrity for National Register listing. Belmont Square retains sufficient integrity of location, setting, design, feeling, and association for listing on the California Register for its association with David Whitmer and his experimentation with garden complex ideas. Next. Sufficient time must have passed to obtain a scholarly perspective on the associated events or individuals. Again, while the nomination may not need to document the exceptional significance required to satisfy National Register criteria consideration G, scholarly perspective must still be documented in a California Register nomination. Next. So, among the issues that we see, forms are one of them. The 10900 form for the National Register nomination is a single, complete, continuous text forms. While the National Park Service is still accepting continuation sheets, they're no longer necessary, which means all of the information can be included in one single Word document, which is then converted to PDF for posting on the website and eventual transfer to the National Park Service. California Register nominations require DPR forms, Department of Parks and Recreation forms, that may have been designed by archaeologists for survey purposes, and they can be challenging to use. Multiple forms are required. As William indicated in his presentation, we do suggest that NPS map and photo policy guidance be followed for California programs as well as National Register. Now, neither register allows properties to be listed over private property owner objection. A property determined eligible for the National Register is still listed on the California Register. A property nominated directly to the California Register and determined eligible is just that, determined eligible and not listed. Local government must be given 90 days in which to comment on a California Register nomination before it is even submitted to the Office of Historic Preservation for review and possible edit. Now that's twice as long as the keeper of the National Register's usual review period after commission action. The one difference that this concept of faster, where that may have come into play, is that listing on the California Register is effective the date of the commission meeting. So there's not that post-commission review. But again, that 90-day review before OHP staff even see the nomination can definitely add to the time, because once the nomination comes in, we then have the opportunity to start our review and request for additional information. So at this point, I will pause. This is the end of the comparison between the National Register and California Register, and see if there are any questions before we move on to case studies.
Thanks, Amy. Any questions from commissioners for Amy? Janet?
I'm just wondering, and thank you, that was a really good explanation of the differences between a comparative difference of the programs, which is something that I've struggled with at various times over the years, working with the city of Los Angeles. But do you often get folks that are proposing to nominate for the National Register that once you review the nomination and look at all the information, you are making the recommendation for the California Register?
I personally haven't had any yet that have gone that way. William might be able to speak to that. And maybe not specifically the California Register, but I believe that the Chinese temple he had on the November agenda was one where, if only there were a number of issues where it might have been listed on the National Register, but it had been moved, there had been changes, there had been, a number of issues, and yet it still had that connection with California history that merited some designation. So, the point program was the most appropriate for it. So I'd say we definitely see more where people come in thinking one program and we move them up, as opposed to them coming in at the top and us needing to shift them downward.
Right, because like you said, they think it's easier to start with the California Register and they may get the same benefits from it in terms of project review or whatever at the local level. And I was curious about the 90 days review for the local government. What's the purpose of that? Because if it's owned by a private property owner, normally that wouldn't have any bearing on it anyway. If they disagreed with the nomination, would it?
Actually, for this, I would defer to either Jay or Janon, who was involved in the creation of the California Register program, because that's something that's actually written into the regulations.
And that's not necessarily, you don't have to be a certified local government. That's just all properties.
No, it's all properties, and it has to be sent by certified mail. And the
Right.
certified mail receipt actually has to be included as part of the nomination package.
Right. Yeah, I'd be curious if they could answer that.
Yeah, I have to admit, that's a good question. And I don't know. I believe in addition to being in the regs, I think it is also in the legislation. So perhaps at the time that the legislature was considering, creating the program, there was some sort of input from local governments where they expressed wanting to get these things. It might also be, I don't know for a fact, but maybe it also has to do with the fact that most of the time when local governments are reviewing something, it has to go before either city council, planning commission, a historic preservation commission that meets maybe once a month and has its own noticing requirements. And so sometimes the 60 days that we afford before the actual SHRC hearing of a nomination sometimes isn't enough time
Right.
for a local government to get the nomination, get it scheduled, get it heard, and get comments to us. So perhaps there was some concern when the legislation was being considered about front loading that so that local governments would have that opportunity to comment. But yeah, I don't know if Jay knows, but I came in when the program was new and nobody ever explained that to me. It was just one of the rules. So.
Okay.
This is purely just my impressions of laws and legislation and getting legislation through the approval process. I get the feeling almost that it was kind of a check and balance on some aspects of the California Register that might seem unusual, like the ability to nominate a survey, which has never been done. And so I'm just thinking out loud, but I get the idea that there might have been a little bit of a uphill battle to get the California Register passed, and that certainly seems like a big nod to local government. Allowing that local government to have quite a bit of say, or at least commenting authority on our ability to do something like just wholesale nominate a survey. So I get a feeling it might have been part of the give and take of getting that legislation passed. I could be completely wrong, but I suspect that's part of it. And Janon was alluding to some of that too. So.
Or possibly even because of, the implementation of CEQA at the local level and the implementation. So And I have one more just general question. I'm wondering if you all sometimes feel at a disadvantage in reviewing the nominations and, moving forward with comments of not being able to see the properties in person.
For some reason, especially lately, I don't know why. I mean, not even lately this last year, but the last year and a half or 2 years, there have been a few situations where I think that it would have been very helpful to see the property. It would be very difficult, even discounting the COVID restrictions. It's just hard to get around California.
Yeah.
It's so strange in a project review environment, which I did for state parks for 7 years before coming here. And even in a tax credit environment in this office, it's so bizarre how you can speak about a project forever, for weeks, months. And the moment you walk onto a project site, it just opens up, you understand things. And I'll bet the architects on our commission can, to me, it's almost magical. You go and you look at it and you're like, oh, I get it now. So yes, it always helps to see the property, I think. So.
Janet, if I can comment just from my background with local government, it seems to me that land use is sort of the last bastion of full control any community has. And maybe this either came out of one of the associations asking for this, or as Jay alluded to, maybe it was an olive branch to help get legislation over the finish line. At the end of the day, all of our local communities, that's the one thing they do truly get to control is their land use, where so many other things are kicked to a higher level of government. So maybe that was it. But that's a great question.
Has there ever been any local government during their 3-month review timeframe that has objected to the California Register nomination as part of that review?
When it's locally owned, when it's local government owned property, that's
Okay.
the only time I can remember.
But not private property.
I don't, I often, actually, you ask a question that I've wondered, when that would happen. And unless Amy or William remember, I don't remember a local government objection to the nomination of a private property.
Okay.
Well, I've only had 4 California Register nominations in 10.5 years. So it's a pretty small sample.
And another, to Amy's comment too, I debate on, I don't want to, take up everyone's time, but nervously, I recommend that folks that really do have a property that should be nominated to the California Register, I recommend that they read National Register Bulletin 15. And there is even a section of the California Register law that says, it's based in large part on the National Register. But if, a California Register nomination has to discuss context, and the primary document that anyone can read about context in is National Register Bulletin 15. So I've been wanting to say that for a few minutes too. And Amy was kind of talking, in that vein also, so.
Commissioner Volanowith has had his hand up. I just wanted to mention in case.
Oh, hello, Renee. I cannot see you, so go ahead.
Thanks, Janon. And everybody else. I just want to piggyback on Janet's comment a few comments ago. And it's related to, hey, do you ever wish you could see all the properties that are being nominated? And I obviously agree. I mean, when you see something, when you feel something, when you experience something, it's quite different than reading a nomination form. However, I want to ask the question, would that detract from the objectivity necessary in reviewing the nomination itself? Because reviewing the nomination, right, we might understand that a property is significant, but if the group or the person nominating this property isn't doing it properly, or hasn't described it in such a way, or hasn't gone through the entire process in a good manner, that's really what we're reviewing. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. And I don't mean to be the devil's advocate here. It sparked my, hey, there's probably some bit of objectivity involved And also we are evaluating the nomination of the property, not necessarily the property itself.
It would be pretty rare for us in the days when we traveled or in the future when we have the opportunity to schedule meetings outside of Sacramento to actually have a nomination scheduled to be heard on the agenda also be part of, say, like the workshop tour. Exactly for that reason, to, you know, to keep that sense of objectivity and, you know, avoid any potential influence. And I think in the past, I can think of only one example when we were down in Southern California and we toured a mid-century modern home, and that home might have been on the next day's agenda. And that was one of Jay's nominations, I believe. But it is pretty rare, and it would be more likely that we would have an opportunity to visit someplace after it had been listed and brought to our attention.
Yeah, Tara might even be able to comment on this, but we suggested that the entire commission didn't tour the Kaufman House in Palm Springs because it may have been on, I think it was scheduled on that agenda and maybe got pulled. So there's some conflict of interest issues, Tara, right?
Correct. I mean, we need to worry about as commissioners, you know, even if you don't have a true conflict of interest, just the appearance that you might have a conflict of interest. And we felt if we had the commission tour the Kaufman House the day before it was on, you know, before the commission, you know, as the nomination, that there could be a perception that there was a conflict of interest. You know, would it be, you know, we're always careful. I mean, we don't accept refreshments or things like that. But I mean, you know, any little thing, we just thought it would, it could erode the sanctity of the commission. And so we made that determination that for conflict of interest reasons, we shouldn't have the commission tour the property the day before the property is heard. Now, I know in your hearts you can separate it, but again, we need to worry about even the appearance of a conflict of interest.
Thanks, Tara. And I see Alan's hand is up. Alan.
Yeah, this is an interesting issue, and it's broad. One thing that I've seen in the nominations that I've read as commissioner coming through and going through this process of assessment that Jay and William and Amy have shown us is how professional they are. You are using professional standards for significance, historical evaluation, et cetera. And it's impressed me. Again, that goes to the high quality of what we are as commissioners are receiving. But I'm just wondering, Jay at the beginning was talking about how things have changed. How at one point, some of the earlier nominations going back, you know, decades, I guess at this point, were simply not up to today's professional standards. And so I guess my question is, why have they changed? And should we be aware of that? Is there a bias implied in professional standards? One example perhaps is what was missed 20, 30, 40 years ago or whenever. One obvious thing is, you know, nominations relating to ethnic groups in California. From my impression, we weren't getting many of those at all in past decades. But now we are definitely very aware of those, which is really a much better situation. But in the process and in trying to improve constantly our professional approach to these things, are we missing something? Are things being left out? Clearly they were before in previous years because people just didn't consider some of those historical or significant. And I'll put in my personal example. The first National Register nomination I wrote in 1983 was for the McDonald's stand in Downey. And at that point, believe me, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of a popular commercial building under 50 years of age at that point being historic. That fortunately did get through, but I know it took a lot of work to show its significance. But I'm just wondering if our interest in professional standards is also reflecting, I don't know, some bias, so that we're missing something. And I say that although acknowledging that we have expanded our purview just tremendously and all for the better. But I don't know, anybody have any comments about that?
I mean, I don't want to speak over anybody, but though I worry about those things every day, to be honest. And there is an interesting contrast that we are more open. I think we are seeing a greater variety of properties and properties associated with underrepresented groups. But conversely, I do worry on a daily basis that what are we missing? Are we missing properties that might bubble up from, more organically by putting this barrier, and that barrier being really top-notch writing? That's all. That's the only thing I can say. A lot of properties loom large in my mind. We had a young couple contact us multiple times, somewhere like Blythe, a very stripped down mid-century modern motel that this young couple wanted to buy and rehabilitate. And it just, they didn't have the money to hire a consultant to write a National Register nomination. I think the property was minimally eligible. We haven't heard from them. They called and emailed about 3 times and it just falls off. Of course, less than 1% of my phone calls really result in a nomination. So maybe, and that could be for multiple reasons, but I don't know if this answers the question, but I'm always concerned about what we're missing. So.
Well, we are dependent upon individuals out there in the state to give us material.
Yes.
To review. There is no consistent statewide effort to survey what may or may not be eligible, right?
Right.
So that's inherent in the system.
There are surveys, but something that Renee said a little earlier too really struck a nerve, and you alluded to the fact that it's the quality of the nomination to a large degree. There are bazillions of eligible properties out there, but sometimes it does, and I'm real nervous even saying this. I feel like I could get corrected by people higher up in the National Register, but a lot of times it boils down to whether somebody can make an intellectual argument on a piece of paper, right? And you I think you alluded to that a little bit. The quality of nominations. So
I definitely did, Jay. I mean, I teach my students that. I say, look, you need to learn how to write. You need to learn how to form arguments if we're going to do this correctly, because it comes down to the quality of the nomination often. And I hate to say it too, but it comes down to the quality of the nomination. And so when you're saying that and you're worried about that, and you stay up perhaps at night about that, about the Blythe couple, about the other properties that could potentially be missed, and those are sort of comments about access, right? Access to knowledge, access from perhaps underrepresented people that don't have access and yet are living in our so-called sort of living history of California. And I too stay up nights and worry about that. And we discuss that in our classroom, and hopefully that the next generation will take that to heart. And perhaps like you see in the law profession, where professors and students have come together to help pro bono cases that they realize that there's somebody in jail for the last 20 years and they shouldn't be in jail. So too could universities come together, especially our public institutions that should be serving California. Our comprehensive universities should be coming together and perhaps forming some kind of group that will help potential properties and folks that can't afford to hire consultants and so on. But yeah, I don't know. I have another question, but I want to let this continue.
I also I want to let this continue too, but I have a few little comments to make about archaeological nominations that you might be interested in. So, but let's continue this first, if there's any.
Janet, go ahead. Janet.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that interestingly, the standards for reviewing and nominating properties haven't changed. They've been consistent since the 1960s. What's really changed is the application of the standards. And I think some of that has to do with the increasing professionalization of the field of historic preservation. You didn't really have programs where they were churning out people with master's degrees in preservation that make up the large consultant pool that we have today. And the nominations were being primarily done, by, maybe a heritage organization, but not anybody that was professionally trained. But I think it also has to do with the expanding definition of heritage generally from that period of time until now, where you did have this emphasis on monumental architecture and buildings. And now we're seeing much more diversity in the themes and the contexts that are represented, as well as the property types, looking at things like intangible heritage and properties that are not significant at all for their physical characteristics. So I think a lot of it is just an evolution of the field of preservation from obviously it was earlier than the 60s, but I'm talking about from the time of the National Register program to the present.
Janet, I appreciate that. And I think that every discipline probably goes through this sort of evolution. I've often worried that any particular site, structure, location is only recognized because somebody cared, that there's no general, okay, this location in this county is now going to be on the list, but every county is either over or underrepresented because somebody cared. And now that standard is somebody with the ability to write cared. And I think Renee is onto something of pushing schools, whether it's professional pro bono work or even internships. And maybe there is enough of that kind of thing out there that the couple from Blythe could find some internship program of somebody who's wanting to run with their program. Hopefully we get to that point if we're not there. And I will shut up, and Luis has got a hand up. Hello, Luis.
Yeah, I've been following the discussion with great interest. And it strikes me that, first of all, that some states managed to get a lot more nominations than California statistically, but I can't tell you because I haven't looked at this recently. I just know this anecdotally from dealing with NPS and saying, well, why is Kansas or Texas more successful statistically or proportionally than California? And I do agree with Janet that conditions have changed. The country has become more professionalized, but maybe our standards have also become much more professionalized or much more exacting. We've all seen nominations for big things done in 7 pages when there were still typewriters, and those are still valid. I wondered if the overall purpose of OHP is to get more nominations, to get more resources recognized in the state. If there could be a little bit more content on the website on typical cases that could be models. Right? Here's a typical medium-sized commercial property. Here is a small district. Here's a tribal resource, or here's a typical single-family home. I don't mean to go back to the 7-page nominations. That's probably impossible. But I think the fear factor could be calibrated downward if we had examples on the website saying, and I know that we have a lot of instructions on the website as to how to do these things, but people get scared. I mean, what is significance? What is integrity? So they probably need help. I teach writing nominations to students. They get stuck and they're, kind of fully awake. People that should be banging these things out in a week, and they get stuck and they say, well, no, I mean, what do you mean by feeling an association? Or what are these things? So I've always wondered if the instructions on the website for the general public could be better articulated. It would save you guys so much more time if if you just say follow these steps and then contact us. It might save a lot of phone time and a lot of patience. I have a couple of other, I think, useful things to say, but maybe I'll stop there and see if anybody agrees with what I've said or has any comments on it.
This is Jay. I think that we do have sample nominations on the website. They're actually, maybe that's the problem. They're not labeled as sample nominations. They're just actions taken on the commission section of our website. And I do regularly send out sample nominations. I just did this week. I sent the Peter Drucker House nomination to a fellow in the Palo Alto area. But I think, and this is something to discuss with Janon and those that have the authority to make changes to the website, but we probably could more carefully label sample nominations on our website, make it clear. If, I like the way you just said, if you have this, follow this. Something else that you should know is that I regularly tell, on a daily basis, I remind folks that the nomination doesn't have to be real lengthy. It could be, for a simple house, it could be fairly short, but the writing has to still be really crack writing. But 5, 7, I'm talking about just the significance section, 5, 6 pages, 7 pages, and then the description section too. So yes, it already is blowing up though, right? You add those 2 sections, it gets to be a lot of writing. So those are my only comments. So,
Adam.
A couple of years ago, OHP gave a talk at the Society for California Archaeology meeting on nominations. And Jay, you referred to the nominations that need to be essentially written at an academic level, right? And we've been talking about that's a theme where the level of writing to convey historical significance at this stage in this industry is written at the highest levels. And I don't know that our expectation is that all nominations have to be written that way. I think you just mentioned it. It just needs to be written well enough to convey its importance and meet criteria and demonstrate that integrity is intact. When you look at that in a tribal space, I've heard from tribes that they don't feel that nominations are necessary for them to understand that their resources are important and that this process might not necessarily apply. And then there are other tribes that have stated that it's the events, it's criteria 1 or A that really capture what it is they've done there. And it's not data potential and it's not historical significance the way the people who wrote these regulations thought about it, but rather it's the community's relation to that resource. And I think if we want to see more nominations, if that's a goal, And we want to also see an uptick in nominations related to tribal resources or archaeological resources. I think we need to ask ourselves, how do we better partner with the tribes to understand what the symbolism is behind putting a nomination like that together and having it listed, while at the same time understanding the limitations of how data is supposed to be presented and captured without missing the understanding and the significance that the tribe places on it. And we saw a little bit of that with our last long meeting, where there's tribal perspectives that other people didn't understand, and that's okay, they don't have to. And so seeing that and understanding that if this conversation leads to tools to help other people put more nominations in front of OHP and potentially the commission, that we factor that component into those things.
Oh, go ahead. Amy might have some perspective. She's worked on some big TCP nominations.
Jay or Amy, go ahead.
Those have almost always involved tribal representatives, so they've definitely been part of the conversation.
I don't want to stop this discussion, but I know Luis said he had a couple of other comments to make.
Yeah. On the topic of things that we often encounter at commission meetings that are, difficult for the public and difficult for us too. I was hoping that we might have materials on the website or materials distributed at the beginning of the meeting or verbalized by the chair of the meeting at the time that clarify two issues in my mind that keep popping up. One is the narrow scope of our work, and that would be the Borough Flats phenomena, right? Where the public all of a sudden believes that with a barrage of opposition, they can actually affect the thinking of the commission. I'm wildly paraphrasing what happened at the commission. You were all there. They think that we can decide things on the basis of testimony that they give and whatnot, even though that testimony wildly exceeded the scope of our involvement. That's fair to say. So if that could be included in the regular, I was going to say boilerplate, but I hate that word, in the regular stuff that we say before a meeting, or if that can be published prominently on the website so people know we only decide certain things and we don't look at development issues or financial issues or anything like that. Wayne Donaldson at a meeting once corrected me because I started to myself talk to a proponent. Berkeley University wanted to, put a spaceship on top of their existing sweet, innocent concrete stadium, and they did, and they probably lost the eligibility. But they thought that by showing us a beautiful project done by beautiful architects, that we should take that into account. I said no, we shouldn't. And then Wayne corrected me and say, you can listen to it, but you can't, act, according to the information you're listening to. You're prevented because you have a narrow scope of work in front of you. So that's one thing. I don't know if you guys agree or not with that. The other is an old complaint, and I'm sorry to dredge it up again. The other thing I have on my list is owner opposition, which keeps popping up all the time, that we have an owner, very earnestly saying, fine, I'm here. You say it's historic, but I don't care for it. I don't want it listed. And they have the right to do that. we have a right to vote and find it eligible if we so, case in point, the minimally decorative Italian restaurant somewhere in Monterey County or something like that. I forget what it was. That owner and many others like him react with anger. They react. They get some. I've seen a couple of people get unhinged at these meetings in other years. I wondered if our information on the website is sufficient, or if we could supplement that information to give them specific instructions on how to conduct an owner opposition. What happens, which letters get written and to whom, and saves us time, saves us aggravation. That's all I wanted to say.
Luis, I appreciate both of those. And maybe because I've been involved in this a little bit, I get the admonitions we've given. Every time Adam has said, we cannot consider social or economic impacts of this. But I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but the same way with the owner opposition, I think there's a number of people out there that think if they say it enough, they believe it. So they want everybody else to believe it. And, we can harp and harp and harp, but they still want to say their piece. And I guess, as Wayne Donaldson said, we have to listen. But I certainly very frustrating to have to hear from 154 people and they think that the numbers are going to change the vote some way, or leave mad because they think we didn't listen to them. And oh no, we listened, but we just can't consider that. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is to this. Comments?
Just to mention, yeah, we do have the standard language that the chair reads, about how we don't consider these other factors. But as you mentioned, Lee, people don't hear that or don't listen and still have their piece they want to say. We do have a rather substantial document for property owners that goes out with the notification letters that talks specifically about how to support or object to a nomination. So we'd be happy to share that with you, commissioners, and you could take a look at it and see if you have any suggestions for anything we might change about it to make it more clear to people. But we do put that information out there. How much people actually read it or care about what it says is, completely up to them. But we do have quite a bit of information for property owners. And then, we have information on our website about the benefits of listing to try to talk property owners into seeing the value there. But obviously some people are just not going to want it listed for any reason at all. So, but we'd be happy to share that document with you and see. We'd love advice if you have any thoughts about how we might improve it going forward.
Very good. Maybe that would help frustration of all. And I realize there's passion on both sides, and especially when we're talking about property that owners think that somehow the value of it is going to be somewhat diminished by a listing. So yeah, but maybe that would help to review and maybe add some suggestions to try and offset some of this frustration. And with that, Janet.
I was just wondering if maybe, following on Luis's comment, maybe within the meeting, make reference to the fact that those additional materials are online. I mean, obviously you can't cover all those points at the beginning of a meeting, but maybe if the language relating to, the purview of the commission could maybe be followed up with just a mention that there is additional information on the website for property owners, whatever.
William just posted for everybody in the chat section of how to oppose or support a National Register listing. And I see Renee's hand. You're on mute, Renee.
I suppose I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, but first of all, I just want to comment that everything that is being discussed right now is obviously very important, including information on websites, including clarity. I for one, I don't mind listening. I like to listen, and the difficult part is when health and social justice and economics comes into it. But I every time before I have a meeting with somebody about a particular property, I always state, look, this is the charge. It's very narrow. I'm here. I can listen. I feel for you, but that's all I can do. And ultimately, I have to look at the nomination for what it is, and not the other considerations like economic, social justice, so on and so forth. But my real question, and I'm sorry if I'm shifting gears before we want to, Amy mentioned something about DPR forms and the sort of the somewhat cumbersome DPR forms and the potentially incongruous nature of DPR forms between archaeology, architecture, and things like that. Recently, a couple of papers have been written about DPR forms that even claim that they lack inclusion because of the way they are written. And especially in terms of Native American sites and historical era. And because you check boxes, when you check boxes, it clearly does not reflect the gray in the world among us and just the black and white and then the very definite cases. And so I was wondering if the staff could talk a little bit more about their frustrations or perhaps, the positive things about DPR forms. And if there are frustrations and if there are academic papers written that DPR forms aren't inclusive, then is it high time to change the DPR forms and the process to make it more inclusive and to make whether the public, Native Americans, or anybody understand and be able to nominate and use their resources accordingly? As archaeologists, we're trained in DPR forms and we know about checking the boxes, but sometimes you check a box and you think, well, this doesn't quite fit. It's somewhere in between.
Wow. That's music to my ears. I'm if I can speak, Janon's smiling. I'm always griping about the 523 form, mostly because it's cumbersome. Things jump around a lot. They're just very difficult to use. But I'm just really fascinated to hear that there might be some cultural biases built into the form. And that's just fascinating to me, and fascinating that people have written papers on the form. We've discussed and even have worked towards, but we just haven't completed the process of changing the forms for the California Register, kind of moving away from the 523 form. Part of the problem is the way the law was written. If you really read the law, and Tara can confirm this carefully, we have to not only use the 523 form, but the 523 form that was in use at the time that the law was passed in 1992. So the regulations need updating. And certainly if the state tax credit program gets going, we're going to see a lot more California Register nominations. So those are my only comments. I'm just really fascinated when I hear legitimization of my gripes over the last 15 years. So.
The office has actually started down the path of looking at the 523 forms and making changes to it. Unfortunately, it's like we get a certain ways down that road and then something else comes up, our project reviews balloon, and we have to sort of refocus on the things that we have to react to. So I want to say we made pretty substantial progress on the archaeological side of looking at revisions to those forms. I think where we kind of got hung up was on the built environment sort of terminology. It was all part of a larger effort to look at basically turning those forms into more of an app-based product, where you had drop downs for making selections about different aspects, attributes of properties, things like that. So I'd like to see when we have a new CRIS coordinator come on board, I'd like to see that person sort of take that back up and see what we could do in terms of looking at that. What Jay's talking about is actually using a different form for the California Register, so that's a different animal. But the 523 forms are something that we can make changes to. I think part of it is to doing a due diligence in terms of getting public input and making sure we're really being responsive to all the needs of the people who use those forms for so many different things. And the idea of also revisiting them from an aspect of are they really, what I want to say, able to capture what we want to know about resources beyond just archaeological sites and the built environment, but resources with cultural significance, and making sure that those forms allow for us to record that information in a way that makes sense, both for the people who are recording it now, as well as future generations who may be using those forms for research purposes and other things. But I would like to see us revisit those forms next year. One announcement I didn't make this morning, but it has been decided since our last meeting, was we will have a new supervisor of our archaeology and environmental review compliance starting in January. And he will also, his name is Michael McGirt. He used to work for the Office of Historic Preservation many years ago, and has gone to other state agencies since then. So he'll be starting on January 4th, and he will be the new CRIS coordinator for the office. So the 523 forms is one of the projects I'd like him to take on, and sort of where did we leave things and how do we sort of wrap that up and get those changes made so we can do better with them going forward.
Thanks, Janan. And Janet has a comment.
I just wanted to say that if you had any interest in forming any kind of a committee or having input from professionals who use the forms, I'd be happy to volunteer.
Thank you. In fact,
there was some talk of that about maybe 15 years ago when Marie was still there, but
yes. Yeah, from
anyway,
a survey standpoint. We are going to be having a commission committee discussion at your January meeting. At least right now it's on the agenda. So it might be something to bring up, but then by then we'll have Mike on board and can kind of be thinking about, is this a project we want to tackle next year? So, thank you.
Just a point of order. Adam had to leave us, but we still have a quorum with 5 of us. Does anybody need a break before we move on? I'm not seeing anybody jumping up and down, so we will move on. Jay, did you want to talk something about archaeology, did you say, before we move on?
Oh, I don't, if folks are interested, I thought it was part of, one of our accomplishments in the last decade. It's been a while ago now, but when I first came to OHP, there were about a dozen archaeological nominations on our inventory. And out of, even though I had a lot of anthropology and archaeology in my undergraduate years, out of respect to the profession, I didn't feel like I should really take control of those dozen or so nominations. But again, spontaneously, to me anyway, Carol Rowland Nawi asked me, she gave me permission. No, we need to do something about those. And so I felt like then I had the authority, but still not the expertise. But again, the managers allowed us to review those and then send them. We actually wrote a little contract to get them reviewed by a archaeological consultant to find out whether they really were even viable as National Register nominations. So in the end, I think we've, at this point, completely worked through that dozen or so. Some of them fell off because the effort was no longer there. I pulled up some documents. They had been on our inventory list for years, and then we make calls and find out, oh no, that went away years ago, or the money went away years ago to complete that project. But in the end, I think out of that dozen, and Amy and William may remember better than me, I think at least half of those got listed. And most amazingly, William, you should chime in here. After about a 10-year effort, maybe that was brought up at the last meeting. We finally got one of the last of those nominations entirely through the process. I remember that I worked on Cogstone site in Southern California. That nomination this was around 2009 or 10. That nomination, I believe, first hit OHP's desk around 1983. So with Susan Stratton at the time, we successfully got that past the National Park Service, and it was listed on the National Register. So anyway, those are the end of my comments on that.
Like your own personal cold case files.
Exactly. Yeah. I have names that, you might all be interested in, or Renee might really be interested in. Guapia Bit. I think that's the one that just passed. Rancho Cañada de los Osos y Pecho Isle, PG&E nomination. Chatak. I don't even want to try to say the next one. Private property leased to a school district. I think that one ended up getting listed. I just pulled up old notes from managing that project. Do you have something to add, William?
You mentioned Wapiavet Serena Homeland. That one was a part of the issue there was that it was a 6,000 acre district and 50 acres of it were actually Bureau of Land Management land. And so the issue became proper, essentially going through BLM's federal process, and that became a bit of a sticking point. But over the course of several years, including several delays, because the archaeologist who originally did the nomination spent a couple of years in Mongolia. But once we got everybody at the table, we were able to resolve those issues, and so as principally it was a matter of listening and ensuring that all parties were heard. But it is listed now, and thank you.
Any other comments before we move on? Okay, it looks like maybe we're going on to selected case studies.
The multiple property, no. Sorry, did you have a question, Lee?
No, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure who was speaking and I was afraid that you were muted. So go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. The multiple property submission approach can facilitate the preparation of nominations, especially for resources associated with underrepresented communities. Preparers may be subject matter experts who know their resource and community well, without the nomination experience of preservation professionals. Registration program staff have encouraged more active use of the multiple property approach, amending the appropriate multiple property documentation form as needed. Next. William? It may have jumped because the slide should be for Latinos in 20th century California. There we go. In 2016, the Latinos in 20th Century California MPS was amended to change the murals property type to the murals and artwork property type in order to include significant works of art other than murals by Latino artists in California. And I'm very sorry, I was wrong, and we actually do need to go back to the previous slide. A National Register nomination for La Laguna de San Gabriel, the sister California Register nomination to Leg Lake, referenced earlier, was heard by the commission at that time. So this is the nomination that William initially carried as a California Register nomination. And then once it became old enough and we had the ability to associate it with an existing multiple property submission, that facilitated the nomination of this property to the National Register. And so there may be a possibility that the nomination that I carried, the Leg Lake nomination, that too may come forward at some point. And I find it interesting to note that the sculptures at San Gabriel are in considerably better condition than the ones at Leg Lake. And that may be an issue of maintenance and upkeep that the locality has been able to address, perhaps in part as a result of their California Register listing. Next. When OHP was approached regarding a multiple property submission for the Chicano moratorium, registration program staff encouraged use of the existing and relatively new at that time Latinos in 20th Century California MPS. Applicants proceeded with an independent multiple property documentation form and associated nominations, heard by the commission in May 2018. The first comment from the keeper's staff was, why weren't the nominations submitted under cover of the existing Latinos MPS? Next. As heard by the commission in August 2020, the Latinos MPS was amended to add a Chicano moratorium context. In another special circumstance, 2 of the buildings associated with the Chicano moratorium no longer retain sufficient integrity for individual listing on the National Register. With guidance from the Keeper's review staff, the National Chicano Moratorium March-August 29, 1970 nomination was revised to include the buildings once occupied by El Barrio Free Clinic, now Mission Furniture, and Silver Dollar Cafe, included within the district boundary for their direct association with the march, as opposed to other buildings along the route. El Barrio Free Clinic is pivotal to the understanding the broader social activism that resulted in the march, and the Silver Dollar Cafe is the location where prominent journalist Ruben Salazar was killed in the midst of the civil disturbance. Next. In some cases, registration program staff make the association after the nomination is submitted for review. Vernon School, heard by the Commission in August 2020 and listed in November 2020, was nominated to the National Register by a local historical society, a condition of acquiring the building. The modest nomination for a vernacular building that nearly defied stylistic categorization was enhanced by documenting how the building was directly associated with the formation of a Native Hawaiian community, meeting the registration requirements of the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in California, 1850 to 1970 MPS. Next. Similarly, the Chinese Shrimp Camp nomination, heard by the Commission in November 2020 and pending action by the Keeper, was strengthened by its association with industry as a subset of the migration and community formation context of the AAPI in California MPS. Case studies will continue with an additional multiple property documentation example from William.
Thank you. The sample nominations that I've included are along similar lines to the ones that Amy has mentioned, but I wanted to reflect on some of the discussion so far regarding the professionalization of our profession, which has changed some of the requirements, but also a change in the focus of historic preservation from being more of a celebratory program, such as the original intent of the California Historical Landmarks Program, which, as you know, did not originally have criteria at all. It was intended as celebratory recognition to a regulatory program. And changes in our society, not only of the people who we consider significant to our history, but in some ways to being a more litigious society. And if we want to be, the nominations are more emphasis on detail and covering all of our bases, is because these are legal documents that result in substantial changes to the way that governments approach land use decisions. And those arguments and discussions are still very much alive and still very much being regulated. And it needs to be clear very often that the places that we're identifying are significant in ways that are not always obvious. There was also some discussion earlier about objectivity, but this is not a scientific measurement. There is not a device that we can hold up and tell us whether or not a building or a place is historic or not. It's based on the persuasive case made by the nomination. So when we talk about objectivity, we're talking about one person's opinion potentially versus another person's opinion. And much of the language that we use to describe properties, significance, and why is a property significant? Because we are convinced by this document that why we should care about it. In this case, not just caring, but love. In the case of a son's love for his father. The building you see here it's substantially large, but it might not immediately be recognized by a member of the general public as a historic property that they might think of as far as a particularly fanciful high style design. This is the home of Eddie Anderson, and the property was nominated under criterion B in the area of performing arts and ethnic heritage for its association with the working life of Edmund Anderson, an African-American performer best known for his portrayal of Rochester on The Jack Benny Show, initially a radio show and later a television program. And Anderson began his career as a teenager on the vaudeville circuit, born in Oakland in 1905 and grew up in San Francisco. And while touring the East Coast, he briefly met a comedian, Jack Benny. In 1932, he made his first film appearance after moving to Hollywood. And Anderson became the first African-American performer to have a regular role on a national radio program, playing the part of Rochester, Jack Benny's servant. With limited opportunities for upward mobility, many Black actors, including Anderson, calculated that playing a servant was better than being a servant. Despite its reinforcement of racial stereotypes, Anderson's role represented a transition from white actors playing actors of color in radio to a Black actor playing a Black role. As the role transitioned from radio to television, Benny and other show writers made a conscious effort to remove stereotypical aspects from Rochester's character. And with the departure of Mary Livingston, Benny's wife, from the show as his primary foil, the importance of Rochester as Benny's primary verbal sparring partner increased until the end of the television show in 1965. Now, Anderson also performed and starred in feature films from the 1930s through the 70s. The property was nominated under another multiple property document, which Amy had mentioned several, historic resources associated with African Americans in Los Angeles. And criterion B is not necessarily something that can be used for any property associated with a well-known or famous person. In the case of this property, it represents his role as a significant individual in Los Angeles. His title was Mayor of Central Avenue, and that's where this property was located. And he used this as a public soapbox, despite its technically honorary status. And this is also an individual who advocated for African American participation in the Second World War, appearing with the Tuskegee Airmen, and the Grand House reflected his success in the entertainment industry despite the odds, as the highest paid African American actor in Hollywood at the time. And after his death in 1977, he received a star on the Walk of Fame. The property was nominated by, as I mentioned, Edmund Anderson Jr., his son, and recognizing this site, it was done by a consultant, but it was the love for a father and son and the recognition of him as a historic individual that of a type that we are really trying to increase recognition of in our contemporary careers versus simply its architectural style. Another property and another multiple property document was the 4 bridges in Downeyville. These are 4 one-lane truss bridges that were, for the most part, created after the failure of concrete arch highway bridges, which were considered both more aesthetically pleasing and more technically sophisticated by a large-scale flood. And these were submitted to our office by a young historian by the name of Lee Adams. And the nominations came in as a single nomination, essentially 4 bridges within sort of a district. But there were some problems in that how do we account for the space in between the bridges without creating a discontiguous district? And because there was relatively little information, these were relatively brief nominations, how do we justify their listing without substantially greater levels of documentation? But there was an existing multiple property document, the Historic Highway Bridges in California, which could be used to facilitate this. And instead of a larger document, the 7-page nomination that Commissioner Hoyos mentioned is still viable if it can be associated with an existing MPD. These are why they're great but often insufficiently utilized tools. They were resubmitted as 4 different nominations, each for the individual bridge under the cover of the multiple property document, but with similar contexts. And there was actually opposition to some of these because they're one-lane bridges, and there was the perception by the local fire marshal that they should be widened in order to facilitate river traffic. But as we've also discussed in this meeting, the job of the commission is to evaluate eligibility under National Register or California Register criteria rather than other economic or social factors. And on that basis, these 4 bridges were listed in the National Register under the multiple property document. And as mentioned, part of the challenge was that they were submitted by a person who obviously knew a lot about the local history, who had training in historic interpretation and of historic sites, and knew how to do technical writing. It was a matter of transferring that knowledge into a format that would be acceptable to National Park Service. And that's our challenge and our charge, is being as open as we can to the nominations that are submitted and keeping an open mind about what is or can be eligible, and then how to translate that information into a National Register format. But there are also California properties that we care about that we want to share their significance, even though this property located in West Sacramento in the neighborhood of Bright, where it's even less obvious that the Bright VFW Hall might be a historical resource. It was originally submitted to our office by the West Sacramento Historical Society, and there were some confusion because of the nature of the fact that we have multiple California programs. And so when it came in, the documentation used the DPR 523 forms, but nowhere on those forms do the words California Historical Landmarks or Point of Historical Interest or even California Register appeal. They predate the California Register, and originally other forms were used for landmarks and points. So the adaptation to that purpose created confusion in the mind of the applicant, and they were expressed on the form. So when we contacted the applicant and talked about how we need to nominate it for a specific program, that actually ended up stopping the nomination temporarily. But we were able to open a line of communication with the West Sacramento Historical Society, who resubmitted the nomination as a California Historical Landmark. The association of the property is that it is the location of the first all-Indian VFW Hall in California. This was significant center for California Indian activism, revival of traditional culture and heritage, and the revival of traditional Indian dance in Northern California. Formed in 1950, the founding members of Post 9054 were associated with the Federated Indians of California, an organization formed in 1946 in Sacramento to press Indian land claims on behalf of California Native peoples. Lacking formal offices or meeting space, the Bright VFW Hall was a regional gathering location for organizations and events. But as you can see on the panel located outside of the building on the left, the property was originally constructed in 1946 as a community center and movie theater by Jordan Pappy Ramos, a well-known member of the West Sacramento community of Bright's Portuguese community. And the movie theater didn't last long, so it was sold to VFW Post 9498 and renamed the Bright VFW Memorial Hall in 1948. And then 9054, the first all-Indian post, took over the property in 1950, and it became their headquarters from then. So this is a property that architecturally doesn't register as a historic property. Its association is for events and the peoples that made use of this place and made it a significant part of Northern California history. We actually also have a nomination. We're currently waiting. It's one of those nominations where we're waiting for an RFI for the first all-Indian VFW Hall in Southern California, which will hopefully join the Bright VFW Hall. And I wanted to highlight this nomination because, unlike the National Register nominations that you've seen earlier, California Historical Landmarks is a much older program. Originally, as I discussed, a celebratory program intended to recognize tourism sites. But one of the strengths of the program is that despite the fact that even the registration criteria are now almost half a century old, contemporary interpretation of historic sites means that there is a potential for California programs, the Landmarks and Points program, to convey the significance of properties that would not otherwise be captured because they lacked historic integrity, because of there's not evidence physically on the site, or because they wouldn't be recognized because of their architecture, but we can capture the stories and provide a more complete and more inclusive history of California and the individuals and events and places that are significant to our past. And that concludes the presentation, my portion of the presentation of case studies. Jay Correa, our supervisor, will close out with I believe he has some other remarks.
Oh, I really didn't. I thought of some remarks while the meeting was going on, and that is that I sure missed this. I think I miss us all getting together for meetings and workshops and training sessions. So I would leave it to Janan. Do you have some concluding remarks? Sorry to lay it on you.
I don't have any concluding remarks. Actually, I don't want to cut off any questions that commissioners might have in relation to this last couple of presentations that William and Amy made. So and then I'll let Lee close things out for us.
Janet, go ahead.
I just have an observation. If anyone wants to comment on it, not really a question, but I actually, as a consultant, have completed some nominations as well, going back probably to the 90s, 2000s. And another observation I have generally about the nominations over time is that they really are very multi-layered, and we see almost at every meeting properties that are eligible under more than one criteria. And years ago, when I was doing some nominations, and this was a completely different staff in the registration unit at the time, but I was actually discouraged from nominating properties under more than one for the reasons that it takes more time, obviously. And if you have a client, time is money, and that you really only need to meet one criteria to be listed in the National Register. So my observation is just that I really appreciate the fact that the nominations are more complicated in that respect, in terms of really recognizing the full history of a property and, not just kind of taking an easier route. And most of the properties, that I had done in the past were architecturally significant, but they had other layers of significance as well under criterion A and B. But generally those were not pursued.
Janet, I appreciate that in telling the story, it's nice that the whole story be told, not that locked into one and everything else is excluded for posterity. So I think that's great that staff is more looking at these things holistic and nominate them every way you can. Other comments?
I just want to say how useful these meetings are, and thanks to staff for putting it on.
I have to look. It's somewhere.
I was just going to make a couple comments. Number one, with William talking about the bridges locally, I would say that was certainly a case study in how do we get to yes. The staff's help on that of helping an amateur get that together was amazing. And I think that's where the staff of OHP really shines, to try and get from point A to point B and not have people discouraged or go away. And then I was also just going to comment that I did an application back in 1986. And if anybody wants to see a real sad application and how far we've come, look at that one. If there's no other commissioner comments, I was going to ask Renee, do you have any registered speaker or public comments?
I just realized there was one question that came in on the YouTube chat. And actually, I think she misheard Jay's lead-in, but basically the question is, you were mentioning the 17 nonprofit historical society tribal applicant submissions. The question says submitted for 2020, but I think you were saying that was back in like 2015, 2014. She was wondering what counties they were from, what kinds of buildings they represented, if you remember. I know you were just looking at numbers, but I don't know if you.
Yeah, I could get that to her fairly rapidly if she wanted to call my desk. I would go back to the actions taken by the commission for that year. Should I give out my phone number, Janon? I think that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, 916-445-7008. And I'll be happy to get.
And unlike many state departments, we have our phone numbers all over our website too. So if you didn't get that, you can definitely find Jay's phone number and mine and the whole office on our website.
And it's a point of pride. I answer my phone and get right back to you. So.
And I think I'm going to check just the general email. There's nothing in the SHRC email, nothing in the general email. Let me check mine because some people know it's me, and no questions here. So that was it for the public questions.
Any other questions or comments on the case studies section we just had? Okay, thank you all. And I guess I would now move on to public comment in general. And now is the time when we accept comments from the public on items not on the agenda. The commission welcomes brief comments from the public, but cannot take any action on non-agendized matters. Each commenter will have up to 3 minutes. Is there anybody who appears to want to comment? Janon? Okay.
I was muted. Hold on. Yeah, I don't see anything here. So we're okay.
Okay. Any final commissioner comments before I sign us out? Alan.
I just want to thank Amy and William and Jay for putting together the presentation. Very informative, very helpful to me. So thanks. Been wanting to do this for a long time and glad we got to it.
I felt all along that you're one of the commissioners that really was wanting this to happen. So thank you.
Thanks to the three of you. And I'm wondering if anybody from this group is going to move forward and complete an application on the 2009 lunch spot of Jay and William. I expect to see an application on that. So with that, a reminder that this commission will meet again on January 29th, 2021. And the OHP Parks website already has preliminary information on potential agenda items that will be on that agenda. And if there's no other business before us, I guess I will adjourn this meeting. And thank you all very much. And again, everybody stay safe and happy holidays. And let's hope we get to meet in person before too long. Thanks. Goodbye, all. Goodbye to the public.